Welcome back to Ether Hour, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin and a special guest. We're going to introduce him in a moment. Today, we're going to be talking about all things Palestine, the future of West Bank annexation, potential war with Lebanon, Gaza as well, and of course, the background to these horrible conflicts going all the way back to the 1940s and even before that. Ultimately, this goes all the way back to, the creation of the world, but we don't have time to go that far back. But Dmitry, how are you doing? Then we can introduce our guest here.
Very excited to be here, Conrad, and of course, I'm very pleased to be here for this very pertinent and very relevant conversation, not just about modern history, but about current events which are taking place literally as we record and also potentially as the episode is released to the public. So good to be here.
It's great to be talking about this issue, and I want to introduce our good friend Isaac Sweilem. He is a Palestinian who has been a friend of the show for a long time. I've known him well before I even started this show, so it's good to have a long-term ortho bro joining us to talk about something that he knows a lot about. He's got a show himself, so I will let him introduce himself, and we will dive right on into this.
Hello, everyone. How are we doing today? Many thanks to Conrad and Dimitri for having me on the show. I'm very grateful, letting me speak on this issue and giving a voice to Palestinians as best we can. A lot of people like to speak about us, but they don't always like to speak to us. So it's greatly appreciated. Greatly appreciated. I have a show, a podcast called The Unending Catastrophe. You can find it at the unendingcatastrophe.substack.com. And it's basically a history of Palestine from the 17th century up until modern times, basically up until 1948, where I discuss the history of Palestine and what happened in the years leading up to 1948 from the perspective of the Palestinians. Firstly, from the perspective of the Palestinians, before we think about the British, before we think about the Zionists or who this person or that person, how does this affect the Palestinians since, they're the ones on the land and this is all happening to them. And yeah, that's my podcast, the unendingcatastrophe.substack.com. Please subscribe. I hope you enjoy my content. And yeah, thank you for having me on.
That's amazing. And I guess just to start, Isaac, because we do know there's a lot going on in the West Bank, and since the 7th of October, of course, plenty has been taking place in Gaza itself. But I think focusing on the West Bank, to which I believe you have family connections to, specifically from that particular area, but also the looming conflict over southern Lebanon. What are your thoughts as to recent events, especially in regards to Israel ramping up its forces in southern Lebanon? Potentially, we're looking at like a 1982 incursion into the South Lebanon, or maybe like the same one that it took place in 2006. And how can that impact, shall we say, Lebanese Palestinian relations? Are we looking at potentially bringing them a lot closer? Because we have seen Hamas and say Hezbollah, these two big organizations, collaborate before, but right now it does seem like the people of Lebanon and the people of Palestine, especially those who have taken militant arms, and kind of united together in this loose alliance, it looks like they're fighting the same enemy at the moment on multiple fronts.
Yeah, it really does feel that way. Hezbollah has always been a staunch ally of the PLO and a staunch ally of the Palestinian resistance against Israel ever since they're forming in 1982. And right now, and it needs to be understood that a couple days after the October 7th attacks, Hezbollah launched its own, basically started a front with Israel in southern Lebanon as a show of solidarity. It was basically a solidarity front, where the point was initially to distract the IDF and force them to push forces north instead of putting them in Gaza. And those have ramped up into series of just well coordinated attacks on Israeli ISR, destroying Iron Dome systems, destroying cameras, destroying radars and other kind of sensory equipment that the IDF would be using, not only to detect anything going into airspace, but detect anything coming from southern Lebanon itself. And it's actually quite brilliant to see how Hezbollah has managed to do this, especially famously about a week ago, Hezbollah released footage of a drone that they were using where they were shown how they were surveilling Raphael military systems. Raphael, they created Iron Dome and David Sling, if I'm correct, and this is all throughout the port of Haifa, where not only were they showing that, they were showing suburban areas of Haifa. They were surveilling both the civilian and the military ports in Haifa. You could see multiple gunboats and cruisers. And this sort of spooked Israel and spooked Israelis because Israelis have, it's been a very, very long time since Israelis really felt scared, not just on the border settlements, but Israelis in like Haifa and Tel Aviv really felt scared. And the amount of people leaving just in the past week alone, leaving Israel and probably never will return, has gone up just drastically. Already, before Hezbollah released this footage, 500,000 Israelis had just left the country since October 7th. And I think that in terms of your question, I think we are looking at a possibility of a 2006 style incursion into Lebanon. The question is, can he muster up enough forces, train them properly, and basically muster enough political capital within Israel so that he could actually attack Lebanon? Because it's not just a simple matter of taking these forces, telling them to go to Lebanon. You have to call these reservists up, and then you have to train them, and then you have to deploy them to northern Israel, and then you have to get them ready to actually attack southern Lebanon. I think that if an attack happens, it will happen within the next 3 to 4 weeks, maybe end of August at the latest. I can't see it happening any later than that, because if they don't do it now, then support for such an action will just fade and fade and fade. And yeah.
I kind of agree with that timeline real quick, and I know you have a lot of background to give on the West Bank as well as Lebanon and all these areas of Palestine and everything, so we'll get into that. But before we get into maybe some of the background in Lebanon to understand some of the factionalism there, I know you're not Lebanese, but you know a lot more about that than the average American, of course. I want to talk about the West Bank because we're getting these initial reports and we don't have any verification on any of this yet that supposed full-scale Israeli law is either imminently or has already supposedly been, again, no confirmation on that, expanded across the entirety of the West Bank. We're hearing supposed news of, expansions of this, Israeli jurisdiction into even East Jerusalem and some of these other places. So be sure to follow us on the socials. We'll be keeping up with that story if anything actually comes to pass and if anything on the ground in Palestine is reported about this. But regardless of that current reality or not, we're hearing about Miriam Adelson offering $100 million to the Trump campaign, the condition being West Bank annexation, being greenlit by America. I was messaging you offline, Isaac, about how I could totally see them moving forward with this controversial West Bank annexation as Biden is, right now floundering after this debate, focused on this election. And then by the time the dust settles from the annexation, Trump is in there and he's like, hey, look, let's just give it to the Jews, right? And then you sign it away and everybody just kind of forgets about it. And it's another footnote in history. However, we are seeing almost all the even moderate Arab states, supporting a Palestinian state. Mohammed bin Salman now supports a Palestinian state with the capital in East Jerusalem. So with all of that in mind, Isaac, with your background particularly in focus, what is like the situation in the West Bank? How do the people there see themselves in relationship to the Gazans? How legitimate is the Palestinian Authority? Because there's reports that the Israelis are preparing to put sanctions on Palestinian Authority members, despite the fact that all the bluster currently has been against Hamas. So what's with the hate on the Palestinian Authority? So what is the current situation in the West Bank regarding the future of a Palestinian state with its capital in East Jerusalem, the relationship with the Gazans, and the potential for annexation? Because I know just a year ago, Smotrich was also given total jurisdiction over a large area of the West Bank. So for people that aren't super familiar with West Bank geography and the current situation, maybe break that down for us and what we may expect in the next few weeks.
Right. So the West Bank, just to explain the West Bank, is this area of territory that's basically less than a quarter the size of New Jersey, because Israel, Palestine, all combined is slightly bigger than the state of New Jersey. So the West Bank itself is just slightly smaller than a quarter of the state of New Jersey, if that makes any sense. And it's basically west to the Jordan River. It's eastern, the West Bank's eastern border is the Jordan River, and its western borders are with Israel proper as it is. And the situation in the West Bank is very simple. People are really, really scared. Most people, save for like parts of East Jerusalem and Nablus and Jenin and Tulkarm, which have always been hotspots in the first and the second Intifada anyway. But most everyone else, no one talks. People are afraid of what they're saying on WhatsApp or what they're saying on Facebook. About nearly 10,000 Palestinians have been arrested since October 7th, and a lot of people are very scared of being arrested, being beaten and tortured in prison. They're afraid of being killed, especially by the settlers. When October 7th happened, Itamar Ben-Gvir armed nearly 30,000 settlers with rifles and told them to quote unquote defend themselves. And the end result of that self defense, as it were, is that 500 Palestinians have died in the West Bank since October 7th, 100 of them children. Where you've had settlers engaging in pogroms against villages in the West Bank, killing multiple people, destroying dozens of homes and cars while the IDF just watches and allows it to happen. Settlers kidnapping Palestinians, settlers killing Palestinians at random, IDF killing Palestinians at random and arresting them without trial, without cause. The situation in the West Bank is very, very, it's turning into a hot box as well, because in the areas where you do see resistance with like the Lion's Den and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade in Jenin and Nablus and Tulkarm, but Jenin and Nablus specifically, you've had a lot of escalating fighting between the local resistance and the IDF, ambushing the IDF. Several IEDs have gone off, destroying bulldozers and armored vehicles in Jenin and Nablus. And in terms of like annexation, technically speaking, you're right. February of last year, control of Area C of the West Bank, which is the Palestinian designated area that's supposed to be quote unquote under control of the Palestinian Authority, was moved from military control to civilian control, and specifically it's Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister of Israel, who controls Area C. So effectively speaking, Israel basically annexed the West Bank last year in all but name only. But now there's been a lot of talk. There's been a lot of talk, and with these rumors that we've all heard, that Israel basically wants to do away with the Palestinian Authority and annex the West Bank. And what that would look like in reality is basically another Nakba, where they annex the West Bank. They make it Israel, but they don't want to turn those Arabs, into citizens. They don't want them to vote. They don't want them to have a say. So what they would do essentially is create some kind of pretext to justify forcibly expelling them into Jordan or forcibly expelling them into Lebanon. Otherwise, they would basically be forced to openly admit to and create an actual apartheid situation where, yes, these are citizens of Israel, but these Arabs have like a second or third or fourth class citizenship where they don't have the same kind of rights. And that would look very bad for Israel. That would look incredibly bad for Israel. And I think the Israelis frankly want to get rid of the apartheid problem, because Israel already is an apartheid state. And the easiest way to get rid of apartheid is to just get rid of the other race that you're oppressing. And the best way to do that is to just ethnically cleanse them. And I think that's part of the reason why Ben-Gvir had armed these settlers. He wants them to basically to lead the ethnic cleansing, because they're there on the ground in the settlements next to these Palestinian towns and villages.
That makes a lot of sense. And of course, that's quite the foreboding, because if you really think about it, the Palestinian Authority is the main group which holds, well, you can say political power and perhaps even some sort of militia type power in the West Bank, whereas Hamas, as we know, mostly holds power in the south around Gaza. Now, we know the relationship between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas is not, they're not always on the same page, but of course, I think in relation to the Palestinian struggle for, shall we say, more recognition within Palestine and independence, I think they probably are allied on some level there. And of course, both of them are mostly Muslim dominant, although there are Christian participants, I think, in both of these groups. As much as they are a minority, I think it's still worth mentioning. But in the West Bank, I think what's curious, Isaac, is if Israel does make these really strong power moves, naturally, we know Israel's alliance in the south of Gaza. We know their alliance with the Egyptians since the 1980s, very, shall we say, amicable relationships. The Egyptians are building, through American taxpayer dollars and other agreements, selling their beaches to Saudi Arabia, things like that, receiving money for that, building refugee camps in the Sinai Peninsula for these relinquished, exodus out Gazans, right? They're already preparing for that. We know that the Pier project didn't really come into fruition, at least not yet, but we do know they're trying to get rid of the Gazans, I think, long term through that particular capacity, as you said, pushing them out, essentially getting rid of them, clearing up the Gaza Strip. The West Bank is a bit more complicated. Our listeners may be aware of the whole Black October event in Jordan. The Jordanian Arabs and the residents there, they don't have a particular memory of, say, the Palestinian expulsion, and perhaps even a different type of attitude. And we do know Jordan is very much still under, shall we say, not necessarily Zionist control, but they do have this weird connection to perhaps even the Rothschild family in Great Britain, the royal family of Britain. King Abdullah II is an SAS, like British military trained king at the moment, and of course he considers himself a 41st whatever great grandson of Muhammad, a descendant, and of course he's the last of the Hashemite kings who still rules there in Jordan. And naturally, again, he still has that title of the guardian of the mosque, I believe, or the protector of the Dome of the Rock. And it's curious as to how he would react, because technically speaking, Jordan did control this West Bank area in the early days of, shall we say, the formation of Israel. So wouldn't he have some sort of say, or at least wouldn't the king of Jordan and Jordan as a country, wouldn't they have some sort of moral duty to at least defend the West Bank Palestinians? Because, at least that on paper, it does appear as if, the majority Muslim West Bank Palestinians would need some protection from their Sunni brethren just on the east of the Jordan. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the connection with the British is even closer. King Abdullah II is actually half English because, yeah, no, he actually is. His father, Hussein, divorced his first wife and married a British woman, and that British woman, birthed King Abdullah. So he is half. It's called. He is actually half English. That connection is quite literally a bloodline, but a blood connection. But the reason why you haven't seen the Arabs in general, we're speaking specifically about Egypt and Jordan, do anything serious is frankly cuckoldry. There's no other way to put it. The Hashemites put their trust in the British in 1915, 1916, when the British promised to give them an independent state if they rebelled against the Turks during the First World War. And when they did rebel, and they did some fine things, and they helped the British win the First World War, at least in that sector of the war in the Middle East, the British basically betrayed them, said, oh, we're not going to give you an independent state. Instead, we're going to create a bunch of mandates. But in the late 20s, gave the leader of the Hashemites, Faisal bin Ali, Iraq, and said, all right, well, we'll give you a compensatory prize, Iraq. And essentially, the Hashemites they've put themselves in a position where they're very reliant on both the British and the Americans to maintain their power, basically as cucked servants. And Jordan is kind of forced in that position anyway, because Jordan as a country has basically nothing. It's a country of 11 million people where there's very little opportunity for the average person. There's not much in terms of jobs. There is no real water because Israel controls the Jordan River. Actually, they have this water carrier that diverts water north of the Sea of Galilee into Israel, which means that Jordan doesn't get any access to the water. So they actually have to buy water from Israel in order, to serve their constituents. And the king of Jordan is in a very strange situation. At the same time, there's no excuse for what he's doing when the reality is that this is the time when his power does not rest in backing from the West, but it rests in his people, 60% of which at this point identify as Palestinian. Frankly, all of them are essentially Palestinians because the Kingdom of Jordan is a fake creation by the British. I'm just gonna be. I'll be quite frank, and I want to say this real quick. Get it out of the way. Maybe we can discuss it a little later.
Bro, he's descended from Muhammad, bro. What do you mean?
Well, I mean, he probably is descended, but I'm like, I don't doubt. I'm not sure if I doubt. I wouldn't necessarily doubt his claims of being a Hashemite, but these countries in the Middle East, and I want to be careful how I'm about to say this, are not real. By which I mean the people who live there are real, and they've lived there for millennia, and their culture and their history is beautiful and rich and wonderful. But the political boundaries are fake. The Iraq and Jordan and Palestine as they exist in terms of political boundaries, especially Iraq and Jordan, were created so that the British could guarantee protection of their oil pipelines going through Iraq and ultimately out of Haifa. Right? This is all just fakery in terms of the political boundaries. And it's incredibly frustrating. But here's the thing, his power relies on his people. All he has to do is just overtly oppose the Zionists on some things. He doesn't have to go full war, all he has to do is just shut down the embassy, stop trading with Israel, make water demands about how the Jordan River, which his country has as its namesake, is just as rightfully his as it belongs to Israel. And he's going to be like, listen, we're going to start getting water from that too. And if that means we have to blow up your national water carrier, we'll blow up your national water carrier. The people will love him for it. They will love him for it. He actually has an opportunity to be a real Arab leader, because in terms of Arab leadership, the Hashemites are the only ones that have any real like claim to be okay. We're the guys that can lead the Arabs, right? Because why? Well, it's because we are Beni Hashim. We're descended from the Prophet. Historically, we were the custodians of the mosques of Mecca and Medina, and I am the custodian and the protector of Al Aqsa compound. He's the only guy that has that kind of authority to say, I can lead the Arabs, or I can do this, that, and the other thing. But the problem is he won't use that authority. He'll just bluster and then make the late epic Navy SEAL edits of him inside of a plane, where it's called, barely fitting into a uniform, while the Jordanians fly paltry amounts of aid into Gaza through airdrops that most of them go into the sea, and the Gazans are basically forced to swim into the ocean to get what little food it is. The whole thing is just humiliating. It's a humiliating experience for them. In terms of Egypt, El-Sisi, I'm not sure how I feel about El-Sisi. El-Sisi obviously is very much, while I don't think he's willing to risk himself and his career for Palestine, I don't know how willing he is to risk his career for Israel. Because internally, the Egyptians are pissed off. The Egyptians are incredibly sympathetic to the Palestinians. And they are incredibly, incredibly angry at El Sisi for Abdel Fattah El Sisi is the president of Egypt. They're incredibly, incredibly angry at El Sisi for not doing anything. There was a spat a couple weeks ago, we remember, where several IDF and Egyptian soldiers duked it out, and a couple Egyptian soldiers died, and I think at least one IDF soldier died in the process. And in my opinion, I think the Egyptians started that, and I think the reason why the Egyptians started that is that very likely that local unit was just so angry at seeing the IDF occupy the Philadelphia corridor, which is this strip of land on the Egyptian Gaza border, and they were just sick and tired of basically being made to feel like cucks by Israel. And I think El Sisi, because here's the thing, El Sisi has basically mustered several infantry and armored divisions up at the Sinai, and I don't know how willing he is to take these refugees, because he can't afford it. If he takes all 2 million of them, it will destroy the Egyptian economy. Firstly, secondly, if the people don't kill him, the military will kill him for doing it, because there's a lot of junior officers who are really angry and they want something done. And you want to talk about Islamic extremism. Well, the Egyptians have a problem of banditry and just Islamic militants hiding in the Sinai Desert to begin with. And 2 million angry, pissed off Gazans, hundreds of thousands of young men who have lost everything and lost their families, lost their homes, their livelihoods. Oh, those are easy pickings for those Islamic militant groups. Like, you want to talk about Hamas too? Like, these are the problems. I don't think El Sisi is willing to risk himself or even risk Egypt, risk the future of Egypt simply to appease Israel. And I think and I think he's also aware of the fact that the Americans' backing will only go so far, because in 2013, Hosni Mubarak, who was, sorry, 2011, I apologize. Hosni Mubarak, who was a staunch ally of the Americans, and he'd been the president of Egypt for 25 odd years, and the Americans backed him, and they were committed allies with him up until they weren't, when the so-called Arab Spring happened, and the Egyptian people massed in Tahrir Square, and Obama told Mubarak to resign. And Mubarak was shocked by this. And I think El Sisi is aware of this. He's aware that American backing only goes so far, especially with the Americans just floundering and just incompetency in dealing with this situation as a whole. So I don't know how willing he'll be to take these people in. I think he will basically tell the Israelis no. That's my prediction. I could be wrong, but that's my feeling on it.
I think that's a pretty informed position. Yeah, I agree with a lot of that about Jordan, and I think you're like you said. I agree that the whole Hashemite kingdom thing is ultimately a total creation of the other Western powers that have been busy in the region. But before we move strictly on to Lebanon, I do want to get your take just generally on what the local Palestinian reaction is going to be if we wake up tomorrow and hundreds of settlers, thousands of settlers are moving all throughout the West Bank. New settlements are being set up. We're just reading today that, 11 buildings were destroyed, homes are being destroyed once again. If people are moving into East Jerusalem, I do want to know. Again, we're also about to get into the background on the Lebanese civil war and what, led to the current factionalism going on in Lebanon before, again, the potential invasion there, which is, it's crazy how many fronts we're, you know, we're dealing with here. But I wanted to hear your thoughts on like what will happen on the ground in, some of these places in the West Bank if not necessarily Gaza style, but Israel's best shot to fully move forward with West Bank annexation happens. What is going to happen on the ground? How strong is the resistance there? I know at the beginning, since October 7th, people have been saying, there's no Hamas in the West Bank, but I've been hearing more and more reports of people obviously militarizing, like you said, in response to some of these Israeli incursions. So before we move to Lebanon, and you can do that if you see a connection as you see fit, I want to hear what you think is going to happen if the worst case scenario unfolds for the Palestinians in the West Bank.
Well, there's been smuggling of weapons into the West Bank for a while, whether they're being smuggled through Jordan or through Lebanon or through Syria or through Israel proper, through Egypt or Gaza or Hamas. That's how or sometimes the local resistance just straight up steal them from the IDF where they find them. But there's been a lot of just arming and militarization by the local groups. You have the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. You have the PFLP, which is the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is actually a left-wing group, and the Lions Den, which is a not it's not affiliated with any of these major groups. They're basically, to put it frankly, a bunch of black-pilled Zoomers who decided, whatever, man, if I'm gonna die, I'll take some IDF with me. And they started no, they started, I think, October of 2022, if I'm correct. And they had a massive following on TikTok. Then TikTok banned their accounts, and you have these different groups that are actually very coordinated now. They've been incredibly coordinated over the past couple of years. The resistance and the different resistance groups had been sort of disparate, no real aim, but in the past several years alone, they've been working together a lot more closely. And if any real like annexation happens, if the settlers really start to like not just build settlements on like a piece of property, but if they start to really push people out of their homes or destroy people's homes, I think it's going to be a third intifada. I mean, people have been talking about third intifada for years, especially post 2021, with a lot of the violence and the hubbub that happened then. But I think we're looking at the possibility of a third intifada that will go beyond just the strikes and the rioting. The militants will be a lot more aggressive, not just in attacking the IDF, but there's a possibility that they'll say, you know what? I'm sick and tired of these settlers. We're going to drive them out, and we're going to scare them, and we're going to drive them out. So expect not just violence against the IDF, but the possibility of violence against settlers, which frankly is justified because these are people who are violently taking the homes of Palestinians, violently attacking them in the middle of the night, destroying their homes, destroying their cars, killing them, walking around with rifles and just harassing and hurting people. And so, like, that kind of violence against a militarized paramilitary group, which is what the settlers are in the West Bank, is absolutely completely justified.
That's really interesting, Isaac. I was just curious because, as we know, the Palestinians of the West Bank are very much ethnically sort of united, but religiously speaking, and we see this in East Jerusalem where you literally have quarters divided amongst religious groups. What are the religious divisions of the Palestinians? Maybe give some of the listeners a ratio-wise example. For example, this many Palestinians are Roman Catholics, or this many are Eastern Orthodox Christians. How many, for example, are Coptic, so-called Oriental Orthodox? And again, because we do believe the majority are, of course, Sunni Muslim, but the Orthodox and the Christian contribution to the Palestinian cause in the West Bank, and perhaps even maybe you can comment on their reaction to the Israeli settlement, if there really is any sort of collective reaction, because as we know, besides the Palestinian Authority, it doesn't look as if there is much leadership from, say, secular Orthodox Christians in this particular area, besides, of course, the few Orthodox Christian priests from, say, the Patriarchate of Jerusalem who actually, say, speak up about the atrocities caused by the Zionist Israelis in these areas. And they have been speaking out quite openly over the last few decades. But yeah, it does appear as if there is almost a secular political leadership blackout on the Christian end of the, say, West Bank Palestinians. It's like there are no influences, there are no, say, political leaders, as we saw in in Lebanon, for example, where there were clear Christian, like, warrior political type leaders during the civil war of like the 1970s and 80s. Maybe you can comment on that and give some of our listeners this rare insight, which typically you won't really find accurate details about online.
Well, the religious divisions are basically non-existent. In fact, the problem that Palestinian Christians and Muslims have isn't religious tensions and divisions, but ecumenical unity that's very spiritually worrying. It's not uncommon to find a Palestinian Christian when you ask him about the Muslims. It's not especially if he's like a baby boomer. It's not uncommon for to hear him say, "Oh, well, I have a Quran in my home that I read. And sometimes I've gone to Friday prayers with with my Muslim neighbors." Close to 90% of Palestinians in the West Bank are Sunni Muslims. The remaining 10 to 12% are Christians. And of that 10 to 12%, over half of them are Orthodox, and the rest are Catholics, Anglicans, Baptists, Lutherans, well, Armenians. But there's like less than 1,000 of those, unfortunately, left in the Armenian quarter of Jerusalem. Not too many, a handful of Copts here and there, but that's mostly what we're talking about. A majority Orthodox population of Christians with Catholics and different mainline Protestant groups, Lutherans, Baptists, Anglicans, and there are no divisions like in any real like serious way. So you have to understand like, and the reason for that's very simple. So prior to 1948, and especially prior to the Zionists, religious divisions didn't like really manifest themselves. People were very relaxed about their faith. They were personally quite pious, but if you went to a village in Palestine and you asked him, "Hey, why are you a Muslim?" He'd say, "I don't know, because my dad is a Muslim. His dad before him was a Muslim. And I don't know, I just am. Why do you pray 5 times a day towards Mecca? Because my dad does it and my grandpa does it." Same thing for the Christians. Like, why are you Christian? Oh, well, we've been Christians for centuries. We're always Christians. My great grandpa helped build the church, and my uncle is a deacon, and etc., so on and so forth. They take their faith seriously, but they don't really think too much about it. And even prior to 1948, you had villages that were mixed Muslims, so like half Muslim, half Christian, or a quarter Christian, three-quarters Muslim, or the other way around. You have entirely Muslim villages, entirely Christian villages. There were a lot of entirely Christian villages that the Zionists destroyed in 1948. Villages like Irkut, as an example. The story of that village always breaks my heart when I hear it, just because of what those people actually still live in a refugee camp not 10 miles away from the original village. And since 1948, they have been trying and fighting just to go back to their original homes and to rebuild what they had left. That community still exists. But and God bless them for it. It's a community of Christians that just want to go home. And so, but it's just like, I mean, you just lived your life. You go into Jerusalem, you go do your pilgrimage, or you say your prayers at the Dome of the Rock or the Sepulchre Church or what have you. If you're a Muslim, you see the Christians, you greet them. If you're a Christian, you see the Muslims, you greet them. There were no serious like divisions, but what happened is the reason why you've had so much mass like solidarity, Muslim and Christian solidarity post 1948, is that the dynamic changed. Because even though there was no real like no one had a reason to fight each other or to be angry with each other, but now post 1948 there's a reason for everyone to be united, because especially, and this was especially true post 1967 when after the 6 Day War, Israel annexed the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And especially in the West Bank, Israel implemented a very brutal military occupation that exists to this day. And I want to make it clear that this military occupation is brutal. You can be arrested at any time without warrants or without charges, and you can be put in jail for up to 6 months before even seeing a judge. It's called administrative detention. And that judge, if he wants to extend your stay for another 6 months, he can. And you will never be charged for anything. There are people who have spent years in prison as part of quote unquote administrative detention. They have never been charged with anything.
Thank you for listening to this free segment of the Eighth Hour. For the full subscriber-only episode, make sure to check out our World War Now Substack in the video description. In the complete episode, we discuss the raging conflict between Hezbollah and Israel, the complex relationship between Christian and Muslim Palestinians, as well as the definitive position of Christians on the ideology of Zionism and Talmudic expansion. When you subscribe to the Substack, you will also get access to 40+ premium episodes as well as exclusive articles. We thank you again for your support.